Good morning. How are you? Well, I was supposed to come and talk about responsibility. Those of you who know me know that I'm quite responsible. I prepared this talk about 4 or 5 days ago only, and well, let's see what we can do. I'm going to mention several things. I won't give you the links, but maybe later you can download them. So let's get started. We're going to talk about the responsibilities that we have at work. The responsibilities that we have toward people, our users, responsibilities vis-à-vis our peers, those of us in this room, and to ourselves. So, toward people. This is relatively easy, at least that's the way I see it. I think that the basic thing is don't be evil. This used to be Evil's slogan. I don't know whether they continue to use it, but we can use it anyway. And in 2004, Larry Page, one of the founders, wrote a letter where he said, "Don't be evil." We firmly believe that in the long run it will be better, both as shareholders or anywhere else. It's good to be part of a company that does good things, even if that means leaving aside some short-term objectives. And that, for me, sounds very sensible. That is, sometimes you have to yield some money if you're doing something good for the world. So in the case of Google, they're thinking more of the results of searches, how they're going to arrange the things. It's quite limited to what they do, and it's wonderful for them, but I want to go a little bit beyond that. I want to read this, and I want us to think of this, thinking that whatever we do should be to improve the other people's lives. We should never try to damage anybody's life or do bad to people, do evil. Some years ago, I worked in a company that sold contents through SMS, such as ringtones. The last product that I worked with at that company was a service to which you sent the name of a song. We tried to process it to see what was indeed the song that the person was looking for. We sent an SMS saying, well, if you want to buy a three-song pack, including this one, you ask the client to say okay, and then the person downloaded, and we gave 2 credits in the favor for the 2 searches, but the application didn't say anything, and most users, I don't remember the percentage, but never came back to look for other things, but it was designed for you not to remember. So when I told my boss, the development director of the company, I said, this is not right. Maybe we should give them the link or say something to them. And he said, no, this is the way the company makes money. But we're stealing. That's the way we make money, he insisted. That was the day I decided to look for another job. So it's not a good thing. When we are doing something, we have an ethical responsibility for users to do something for them. We cannot just try to damage people or to fool people just to benefit someone that wants to make more money. I'm not saying that we should forget about money. We shouldn't be hippies. Everything is okay. It's okay to make money. But what I say is, whenever you do something, try to think of how that is going to enhance other people's lives. It doesn't have to be a substantial improvement. It may be something small. Maybe it's because you want people to be able to spend more time in in the things that they are interested in, or for entertainment or whatever. The important thing is not so much what you do, but the idea that whatever you do will be to improve things and not to worsen things. Beyond the philosophical discussion, there are some specific issues that we can discuss that may simplify people's lives and to make it better. So that's what we're going to address. The products we develop need to be understandable. Something that is not understandable confuses people, frustrates, make them go through a bad moment. So, and part of being understandable is that they should be simple, straightforward, and easy. By simple, I mean simple comes from the Latin, that is simplex, that means a thread in a dress, or basically just one part. Something simple is something that has a few parts. It's something that we can understand because we can see the whole thing. Something easy, on the contrary, is something that we can understand because it's close to us. It's something we are familiar with. If something is simple, it's either simple or not. Well, you have degrees, but it cannot be simple for me and complex for other people. While easiness is something that is subjective. It may be, for instance, a space shuttle is very, very complex. We are speaking of millions of parts that need to interact in harmony. For me, it's very, very difficult to understand how it works. I don't understand it, but for an engineer, it might be much easier. So easiness is relative. I recommend, if you want to read more about simple and easy, I recommend Rich Hickey's Simply Made Easy. This is a lecture, it's a talk that Rich gave that has very interesting things. In the context of users, anyway, let's speak of the interface, how simple and easy the interfaces are. Most of us are software developers, not designers, and maybe we're not the best known for developing very good interfaces or very nice. Look at this. This is a promote. I didn't want to look for screen sheets for it, because I was afraid of doing things. We want interfaces that are simple, with just a few things, to make it easy to focus on them, and easy so that they may sound familiar to the user. Now, how can we do this? How can we approach this issue and to prevent our users from suffering? It's a complex issue. We could discuss it for hours, and unfortunately, we could devote an entire conference for that.
Así que voy a hacer trampa, voy a parar en hombros de gigantes y.
So I'm going to cheat. I'm going to cheat and give some conferences. It's the first three that I thought of when the first time. There are many, many things that you can do.
Trucos y.
If you have tricks and basic hacks that we can apply as programmers to understand how we can develop easier and simpler interfaces, or at least not as ugly, you can send me links and I can add them. But in the end, these basic techniques that we can learn about typography, space, and color, these things that really make the user's life more enjoyable because they don't see such a jammed page, are only the basis, but they are not the solution to the problem. So how can we give the users something that is really good for them? The answer is easy. Bother designer. They love to be bothered. They don't bite, at least that's what I think. But the important thing is that we don't need to know everything about everything. We cannot aim at that. It's impossible to know everything about everything. So whenever we have, and I'm not just speaking of design, we need to be able to look for assistance, for help. We have to know who to call when we need something. Let's speak of performance. GitHub has the Zen of GitHub, that is some quotes saying how to face their philosophy. One of them, it's not full shipped until it's fast, and responsive is better than fast. By that, they mean that you don't deliver the whole thing until it's fast enough. And something that achieving something that is responsive is better than achieving something fast. And what do I mean by this? Our responsibility is to deliver software that runs well. If it runs slow, it's not running well. That's not the discussion. But not only is it important for it to be fast, it has to look fast. Sometimes we can hide the fact that it's not fast. We can design the interface in a way that you won't notice that it's slow. I think that most of us do this, and if you don't, maybe you should, is to put the JavaScripts at the end of the body instead of at the beginning. So when the browser starts, the JavaScript stops renderizing the HTML. It doesn't do things, doesn't show things until it evaluates all the JavaScripts. That means that if you're in hell and you have to download 2.5 megas of JavaScript, that's not so difficult, and you are in a 3G mobile, and the user will open the page and will have a blank screen frozen for 5 seconds. He won't be able to do anything, to interact or to move. It's very frustrating to be facing a screen for which you cannot do anything. You put the JavaScript at the end, and the time is actually the same. It takes just as long to evaluate the JavaScript and do everything, but first it'll renderize all of the interface. The user is looking at the contents, and only then will it freeze, maybe for 1 second or whatever, but it is not stopping. At no time is the user jammed. There are many things that you can do like this, that is to load parts of the interface and then others through hash. There are many things that can be done. The important thing is not to get the users stuck. So let's do things, but we should not overdo it. This is one of the most common. The fact that we have to make the code act quickly doesn't mean that we need to run and change everything. The code needs to be, above all, maintainable and understandable.
Entonces, no sé, salir a cambiar, tipo.
But for instance, go and change all the divisions in the code for midways operations and duams and shifts to save 5 cycles of the CPU doesn't change anything. Maybe if you're doing a pacemaker or something like that, it could be. But please don't do anything for a pacemaker in Ruby. But the only thing that you're doing is making the code more complicated, more difficult to understand for an optimization that won't give you anything. The only optimizations that matter are the ones that the user can observe. If the user can't observe the change in performance, you are just wasting time and money in something that's not really worth it. You need to be pragmatic. That is, you need to make things run well. You have to respond if they don't run quickly. But you should not go and optimize to the smallest detail. Now, let's talk about the responsibility that we have with our peers, with our colleagues, those of us in this room. In my first job, a friend of mine said something that I think that was the phrase that really marked my future life. You need to program as if the person that's going to maintain your code in 6 months is a psychopath, a murderer that knows where you live. That is, it's the fact that people say, "Well, you are a disaster," it freaks me out. Or I'm also, well, I don't like the idea of having someone come and looking for me to kill me. So to avoid this from happening, it's good to make things easy to maintain so that people won't get angry at you.
So what is maintainability? So this is something that is rather diffuse. I don't know if there's a good way of describing this in one single concept, so I will speak about the things that I think make software something maintainable. They should be legible, they should be clear, understandable, and easily modified. So this involves reading much more code than what we write. So every line of code I write, I have to read it in 5 minutes more, and then when I test, I try to check and if there's nothing horrible, and if I realize I wrote something horrible, I said, well, let's fix it. And in 1 month's time, someone else is going to read it to fix something else or to incorporate something else. And in 6 months' time, a murderer and a psychopath is going to read it. So we have to make the effort of writing legible code. There are some basics to this. Everything has to be indented. And even in 2014, there are editors who indent everything. I am afraid of that. I'm speaking about Eclipse. I am. We have to, well, come to an agreement with the people we work with, which are the styles, the lines of the style that we want to write, and we have to be consistent. I cannot go to the files without switching between things that have nothing to do with one another, because this distracts you and it keeps you from reading the code. It has to be direct, you have to be able to read it, it has to be succinct, and it has to be concentrated. For example, these 2 snippets here. They do exactly the same thing. The first one is much easier to understand. Less code, less parts, it is simpler. We can visualize it faster. The second one you can read, it takes longer to read, and of course this is a trivial example. But the first example is much near to the normal language. We normally say, I want to say this word 10 times. You don't say, I want to have put up one finger, say this word, then say the second word until I have 10 fingers and say the word. Nobody would say it in that way. I hope so. And because it is closer to natural language, this makes things easier for all of us. We can understand what is happening here. Ruby is a wonderful language for this. It is succinct. It helps you express yourself, similar to a natural voice. Some people say, well, this is not enough, and say, well, I want this to sound like English. It has to flow. In Ruby, you can read these meta languages, DSLs, and they sound more like English and as natural as possible. Now, what about our duties? When we try to implement something and say, I'm going to do this, which can be much easier to read and it will be similar to English, we should ask ourselves, now should we? And when the answer is no, it is no. Magic is far more difficult to maintain. We always have to look and make the effort to strike a balance between legibility and maintaining what we want to do. If you add a layer for legibility, is adding more work to understand what is going on. This adds more complexity. You're not gaining much, so you have to assess to what extent that is justified. You have to ask yourself, well, and really stop to think, what is the real benefit for maintaining the code if this can be read like English or like Ruby? So what is your gain there? Cucumber, for example. But Michelle will speak about this tomorrow, so I don't want to digress in that direction. Good code is understandable. I can read the code and I can understand what is happening. That is in general. This does not mean that you don't have to document what you do. I'm not saying, well, to document every single line of code. Of course, please don't do that. What I'm saying is that, well, for each method, you can read a couple of lines that explain the purpose of the method, what are the parameters, what it returns, what the interfaces are. In the sense of Java, these interfaces that we write into our code are fundamentally to understand abstractions. So we have to understand what are the abstractions, what is going in and out, especially in a dynamic language. So you need to have this kind of documentation. It is important for people who are new to the code to come and understand what is happening. Beyond the fact that you can read the algorithm that is implementing a method, but you have to understand why and what is the objective. Documentation is also important for those who haven't gone into that corner, and then they can grasp what is really going on. Now, there are two things that I want to speak about with regards to documentation. Documentation has been written for humans. Documentation was not written for a parser to generate an HTML. Documentation is that while you read the code and you're correcting the code, you understand what is happening. So I think that it is not necessary. I don't think that it is bad. It's not necessary to use something with a very strict syntax, and documentation is wrong because you put the at in the wrong place. Well, I'm not saying that. If everyone is comfortable in your team reading in the syntaxes of Yard or whichever, then it's okay, enjoy. But we shouldn't impose a very strict syntax, because what we have to do precisely is to encourage everyone to write the documentation. We have to lower the barrier for entering into this concept of writing the documentation. Wherever I have worked, I encourage people to write in TomDoc. So this is so people can read it. TomDoc is the language for writing documentation that is very lightweight, it is very flexible. And if you're going to write your comments, you're not trying to generate anything, it's not so relevant as long as you say the things and be clear and say if the document is public or not, which are is the input and the output. So you don't have to worry too much. It is not so fundamental that you have to follow the syntax and rules, grammar, etc. However, it is important that this is easy to understand so that you know what is happening with the code. If the documentation is good and it works and everything is as it should, then in a couple of times you're going to be grateful to yourselves, or your peers are going to be thankful to you. But if we speak from here in a couple of months, the other thing that is important is that you have to keep it up to date. It is awful if you come across a method and you see how it works, or you read the documentation and you assume you know how it works, and that is not the case. A couple of months ago, I was working with a friend in a project, quite a complex project, and all of a sudden he had to fix the integration with an external provider. I said, well, this is in the credentials in this and that place, and he tried to do it again. He put the debuggers. He was looking for hours to see what was going wrong. It wouldn't work. He was trying to find the error because the provider sent us an error that wasn't quite reasonable. So at the end of the afternoon, about 5 or 6 in the afternoon, someone else goes into the chat and says, oh, no, the credentials of that provider is wrong there. You have to use these others. Nobody knew where they had been. He didn't even use the wiki for the new credentials. So that is a disaster. You made someone suffer for a full day because you didn't really write and update your documentation. There is a way that is quite effective, in my opinion, which is maintaining the documentation as close as possible to the code. This is within the docs, and with the API docs, that is something that you already have there because you're writing right there. It is more difficult sometimes with long documentation if what you write explains more or less how the architecture of the application works, or how you integrate something with an external service, or things of the kind. So in those cases, many people have a wiki in the repositories, which are wonderful for that purpose. But that is not the case, because it is easy to forget to update the documentation. You can easily forget things. So what I like to do, some people might not agree with this, is to put everything in the code repository, the file docs, and you can write the Markdown RST, whatever you want, and then you have all the documentation there. And then when someone does a pull request, you say, well, no, you first have to fix the documentation, and there's no way to miss it. But of course, you have to remember that you have the documentation somewhere. But that is something that will always happen. So in that way, it is easy. We Rubyists love to have the latest version of everything, to do releases, user releases, the most recent ones. And then there are services like the Ruby Toolbox that have a complete list of the libraries and that they solve a problem. And these people have organized this, And one of the things is showing when the latest release is. And if this hasn't been updated, then they put a red arrow pointing downwards. So don't use it. Now, let us imagine someone comes and they gave me something to do. And I say, well, I look for the tool, and it dates back to 2002. So first thing I think is, well, this must be full of bugs. Who knows? Well, it hasn't had a release for over the past 10 years. Now, let us imagine that that tool is a program to list files in Unix. Let us imagine that is the case. So we're not going to use yes because it is so old. Of course, we use it and it works fine. Now, most of the tools of the Unix section have no bugs. Now, what makes these so robust? Those written in CS. Because they are about 30 to 40 years old, so the bugs could be fixed. But if you look at the history of many of these tools, at the beginning they didn't have that many bugs. So it wasn't a release that was done once a week as with some of the things in Ruby. And what makes these so robust is that they are simple. Unix tools do one thing, and they do this well. They solve one problem. They solve a problem. So simple tools, small tools with a limited scope, and with a common interface for communicating, which allows them to be part of a more complex systems to solve bigger problems. So this is the key of robust and maintainable software as the things that you have in Unix. Michel will also refer to this, so I don't want to digress. But let me reinforce the concept. Write simple software. Aim at small components, at simple components. Simple software can be maintained. It is far easier to understand something works and to maintain it if it's small. Something that the code is simple, clear, and well documented. It is like nirvana when you want to maintain it. Your colleagues won't suffer when maintaining it, and they're not going to turn into murderers who will come to fetch you. Now, finally, let us speak about the responsibility with respect to our own selves. The code that we write is not only for us. This does not only affect us. It affects all the people who interact with the code. It affects users who use the things we produce. It affects our peers who are users in the sense that they are the ones who will be interacting with the code and fixing things, and it affects our own selves. We are the one who writes it. So what we have to do is to try and make the best we can for all those who use the code. Not only for our own selves. We have to do the best we can for the rest. We have to put the hat on of our colleagues to see what our users really need and really step into their shoes to see what their needs are. We have to step into the shoes of our colleagues, of our peers who are going to be fixing all the things we did wrong in the future, and we have to do the best we can for them. We are responsible for doing things properly so that all those who interact with our software don't suffer in the future. We do this so that everyone feels comfortable, because we also It also happens to us when you get something and you have to fix it. We don't like to suffer when we do that job. So be responsible. Be responsible with what you do to improve the world. Thank you very much.